on Liberia. My name is Dennis Jai, and we are broadcasting from Atlanta, Georgia. In tonight's edition of Focus on Liberia, we're going to be looking at one of our presidents. This is a continuation of our Presidents of Liberia series. Tonight, we're going to be looking at the man, President Charles D.B. King. He's the 17th president of Liberia. If you know what I know, Charlie King's time is something that we all talk about in Liberian history. So we're going to be talking about Charlie King. And tonight I have our chief presenter, Carl Family. Carl, welcome to the Liberia History Channel.
It's always my pleasure to be here.
Co-presenter tonight is Darius Lam, aka Jabari. Jabari, welcome to the show.
It's great to be back on.
I want to welcome all our viewers from across the globe. This is the Liberia History Channel, and we are broadcasting from Atlanta, Georgia. We want to get straight into it, talking about the 17th president of Liberia, Charles Dunbar Borges King. Carl, take it away.
Yes, so today we're going to be talking about Charlie King's time, 10 years, 10 months, and 29 days that he held the most powerful position in the Republic of Liberia. And we're going to talk about some of the reasons why our grandparents, when they said, oh, I never suffered like this since Charlie King time, we have not known this suffering. I don't know if they just picked it up over the years from their parents or whatever, but it has become in the Liberian oral folklore quite a traumatic period in history for many, many indigenous Liberians. And I consider Charlie King's time the turning point. This was the actual genesis of the American economic annexation of the Republic of Liberia. The entire history of Liberia up until this point was a David and Goliath battle. Liberia being David and Goliath being super Goliath being, European and American powers. And especially after the partitioning of Africa at the Berlin Conference, Liberia was facing a gigantic Goliath. I mean, one of the greatest stories of David and Goliath, and we kept afloat. We tread water. We pushed against the grain and accomplished great things. It was Charlie King's time that, in my understanding of Liberian history, this is the point where we can demarcate the beginning of the end of the legacy of the victory of David in the David and Goliath story. It is Charlie King's time that David joined Goliath against his people in so many ways, and basically gave up gave up the torch. He was a torch. He was the 17th torch bearer for our sovereignty, our political and economic sovereignty against the greatest odds. And it was during his time that was seated. Now, some people say that this is a good thing. We could not have continued living under the type of pressure that was being placed on Liberia, and that we had no real choice but to give in to imperialism and kind of do the best we could to tread that situation and make way with it. But we're going to explore that today, Dennis, and we're going to see if you all can form your own opinions. Jabari and I are going to lay out information as and presented as it was. We were not alive, we were not present, but the information that we've been able to gather, we're going to present it, and you can draw your own conclusions.
Thank you. Let me get in Jabari for his opening. You pointed out David and Goliath. For those of you not familiar with the story, this is the Holy Week of Easter. So David and Goliath is a very famous story in the Bible, and I hope you understand what that means. David being the little guy and Goliath being the giant. But we'll hear all that when we talk about Charlie King time. Jabari, your intro.
Charles D.B. King is really the person that personifies evil, that personifies betrayal, that no backbone, spineless. This man has no dignity, and he is the reason why everything led to what it is today. And if we're gonna lay out the case that if this man just had not came to power, instead just went somewhere else, maybe go back to Grand Bassa or Sino, Maryland, I don't know, just not the presidency, that Liberia would be better off. But because he was president, it turned for the worse, and now we're still dealing with those consequences.
Thank you. Well, ladies and gentlemen, that's Charlie King time and call.
Yes. So I want everyone to share if you're watching, because we came on much later. I would like if you can share in your chat rooms or groups, so that people are aware that we're doing this presentation if they care to comment and watch live. So I wanted to start out with what we do with every president, which is their genealogy. And we go and look at who their parents were, their grandparents, go as far back as we can. It's important to mention that Charles D.B. King, regardless of what you see on Google or regardless of what people say, he was not Americo-Liberian. Charles D.B. King was the third president of Liberia who was not a descendant of African Americans. Ethnicity is important. It's important to mention ethnicity. I know a lot of times we like to generalize all leadership and say everybody was Congo. Is our own term for Creole, I guess, is just Congo. Because if a person was Christian and they spoke English and had a Western name, we'll just call them Congo. But I want to really just move away from that, because every other country in the world, every other culture in the world has the dignity of being respected by their ethnicity, their nationality. In Liberia, we like to erase people's ethnicity, especially when they raise to certain status in society. Charles D.B. King, all of his ancestors were born in Africa, never left the continent of Africa. He's not a descendant of enslaved repatriates. He is a descendant of recaptured Africans, which is both of his parents, contrary to what people say, were recaptured Africans. Both of his parents were Christian, baptized, and westernized, but they were Africans in the sense that they had never left the continent of Africa. This is very important. His father, C.T.O. King, was a great man. Dennis, if you don't mind going to the next slide, unless you have questions here before I get into his background in genealogy a little bit.
Right. Even though, we assume that a lot of people know when you say Congo and Americo-Liberian, because this is very important. Everything you look at on Wikipedia about Charles D.B. King say he was Americo-Liberian. You're saying that's not the
Right.
case. And there is a
No.
clear distinction between Americo-Liberians and Congo. Just touch a little bit on that before we move forward.
So the generalization really and the homogenization of the two cultures really is a 20th century, from mid 20th century phenomenon. Before then, as late as the 1930s, there was a very clear distinction between the different populations. It was during Charles D.B. King's time that you start to see the erasure and the, kind of, because people are intermarrying more. And also this new population of people who were, for Charles himself, he marries a descendant of African Americans. And so his children are both, and so on and so forth. You've got a lot of, people marrying, for example, J.J. Dosen, who was an indigenous Liberian. He married the prominent daughter of Bishop Ferguson. The daughter of prominent Bishop Ferguson. And so his descendants are both African American and indigenous. So later on, you start to see much more, intermixing, and then, this general term Congo, which is Liberia's version of what we call Creole in Sierra Leone. Creole in Sierra Leone is a mixture of recaptured Africans, educated, westernized indigenous people, and the descendants of people from the Caribbean, America, and the British Empire. So, and the rest of the British Empire. So that's kind of what happens later in Liberia. But for Charles, his parents spoke their native languages, from what it would now be considered Nigeria. So it's not like he was, completely oblivious to who he was. But we'll start off with his father, and that kind of explains there was a bit of prestige. We've discussed this in previous episodes where there was some prestige and kind of a higher dignity attached to being a descendant of an African American as opposed to being a descendant of recaptured Africans. That was kind of, in fact, if
Yeah.
you were an indigenous Liberian very early on, you held more prestige than being a recaptured African. It was a blight to have been a recaptured African because many of these slave ships that were rolling into the territorial waters of Liberia and Sierra Leone, that where they would ships and return and repatriate them. Many of the people on those ships were very culturally dissimilar to the indigenous inhabitants of Liberia and Sierra Leone. They had different ways of life, different practices, and the indigenous people were a bit xenophobic, and so were the repatriated African Americans, a bit xenophobic towards the recaptured Africans. There was a bit of xenophobia. And so that's very important. And that explains why it was more important for these people a lot of times to erase that heritage and try as much as possible to assimilate with the African American descendants. And because also they were repatriated from various places, they did not all speak the same languages. And some people came and they'd be the only person speaking their ethnic language from wherever they were captured from. So it was very easy for them to erase that because they didn't have anyone to continue. But the population of people that C.T.O. King, the father of Charles D.B. King, the Ebado people, were actually recaptured in great numbers. Ebado people were probably the largest ethnic group of recaptured Africans. So Ebado is a subset of the Yoruba people. And we'll go ahead and talk about Judge C.T.O. King and
Yeah.
what he claimed and what I found.
Judge King claimed to have been born in Sierra Leone in 1839. The 1850 census of Murray Town includes he was a liberated, recaptured African, and at the time of the 1850 census, he was 16 years old. He attended school from early childhood until 1856 when he served. Let me make that a little bigger. He attended school from early childhood until 1856 when he served as an apprentice at the printer's trade for 1 year. He then entered the government printing office. There he was soon promoted to the position of journeyman. In 1856, seeing a greater future in a republic, he moved to Liberia and at once began to fill positions of honor and trust. He served as city magistrate, justice of the peace for Montserrat County, marshal of the Supreme Court of the Republic, clerk of the court, postmaster at Monrovia, collector of customs, secretary of the interior, a member of the cabinet and trustee of the Liberia College. He was elected mayor of Monrovia in 1884 and re-elected successively until 1890. Served as agent of the Colonization Society of the United States, holding his office until 1892. He was engaged in transplanting Liberia coffee in Brazil. In 1888, Judge King was elected Grand Master of the Masons in Liberia, a position he held until his death.
Yes. So most of this is from The Bright Side of Africa, published in 1898. A&E Publication House, and this is a book that was written by William Hurd.
Mhm.
And this photo is also extracted from The Bright Side of Africa. So Judge C.T.O. King, at the time that this book was written in 1898, of course, was a judge at that time, and was also had been Grand Master of the Masons of Liberia for 10 years at the time that this was published. I want to talk a little bit about this birth issue. And I hinted to it before you started on the slide about this need to creolize yourself and try to become assimilated. So there was a little bit of a dichotomy because he was very proudly a Bado. He spoke the language fluently. The 1850 census at Murraytown, where he claimed to have been born in 1839, said he was 16 years old and also had him listed as a liberated/recaptured African. Why would he go to Liberia and reinvent himself? It's because Liberian society would more accept him if he presented himself as a Creole born at Murraytown than if he had told the truth about who he was. Because they did not, their own recaptured Africans, you have to remember, at this point, when he went to Liberia, recaptured Africans were not even assimilating as well as the indigenous people, the coastal people were, as like the Grebos and others were. A lot of them were coming from deep in the interior forest of the Niger River area basin. They were coming from the deep interior Congo. Many of them had the scarification on their faces, the ethnic scars to identify themselves. And it was those types of markings in our part of West Africa were unusual. The face markings in Liberia, Guinea, Sierra Leone were usually very minor. You know, sometimes it would be a tattoo, a small tattoo between the eyebrows. The body decorations, the body tattoos, the body scarifications were more common, not the large gashes on the face. So these things, the indigenous and the repatriated Africans usually found to be off-putting, and there's many things written about their complete disdain and xenophobic attitude towards recaptured Africans. And as a result, this legacy of recaptured Africans is almost erased in Liberian history. You hardly hear anyone talking about it. Even to the extent that on the ship Elizabeth, they erased the fact that the United States had sent recaptured Africans on the Elizabeth along with African Americans. So it is really important in my mind that we resurrect this legacy of these people and make sure that they tell, and their story is a part of the Liberian story. So we have a responsibility to tell it fully.
Do you know the number of recaptured Africans that came specifically to Liberia? Because I know in Freetown it was like 80,000 recaptured Africans were in that territory.
Right. So it's estimated somewhere around, so Liberia is a unique case because a lot of our recaptured Africans, in fact, a greater number of our Africans were actually liberated on the Liberian coast, and were not even liberated on ships. I don't know why the indigenous people who were liberated at slave factories are not always categorized as recaptured Africans, but that's exactly what they were. When slavery was abolished at Traytown, and all of those people who were kept in the barracoons to be shipped off into slavery were released, they were not sent back to where they came from because their homes and their villages had been destroyed. They were incorporated into Liberia through the same process that the recaptured Africans were incorporated. So it is a really, kind of interesting thing. So if you include those people, you're probably looking at a good, 15 to 20,000. Not as many as in Sierra Leone, but, not even half of what, even including the indigenous who were liberated. It's probably somewhere around 15 to 20,000. But that number, the British, when the British repatriated people, they kept better records. The Americans did not do such a good job of keeping those records, and also the Liberians didn't do a great job of keeping records of the people that they liberated at the slave factories.
So let me
taking
get
down
this,
their names and things like that.
let me get this clear, because what I learned in Liberia growing up is Charles D.B. King, they came from Sierra Leone. You were saying, and this Judge King is the father of C.D.B. King, that's a Judge C.T.O. King.
Yes.
And you were saying he is actually from Nigeria, part of a subset of the Igbo tribe or ethnic group.
No. There was no Nigeria when he was born.
Right.
But today the Abado people are in Nigeria.
Okay, I misspoke. I mean,
what is today known as Abado is Yoruba, not Igbo.
Oh yeah, Yoruba. So
Hmm.
Abado is a part of Yoruba, and he came from what we know today as Nigeria. But when he went to Liberia in search of greener pasture, I would say he
Hmm.
misrepresented where he came from, because being a recaptured African at that time was not so honorable. People did not look at recap, so he said he was Congo, basically, or he came from Sierra
Yeah.
Leone, from Moretown, and Moretown, I think that's what, and the place where the Creole were,
No, Murraytown was a settlement of recaptured Africans.
okay. So he's now misrepresenting
So
himself as American Liberian.
no,
He's as recaptured
as
African.
he never. So I want to back up. And thanks for clarifying, because I wasn't clear. He did not represent himself as an American Liberian. C.T.O. King was at bottom. He was proudly at bottom.
Okay.
The only discrepancy is that he claimed to have been born at Murraytown in Sierra Leone,
Okay.
which instantly creolizes him. It instantly makes him a Creole, because once you're born in Sierra Leone, it's like, okay, now you're Creole. Oh, my parents were recaptured Africans, but I'm Creole. But the records don't support that. He was actually born in what is now Nigeria, enslaved as a child, liberated at Murraytown. And we had a similar discrepancy with President, um, oh my goodness, which president
Cheeseman,
did we have this discrepancy with? No, it wasn't Cheeseman. It was
Uh, was that
Warner.
Russell?
James Briggs Payne.
Oh
James
yeah,
Oh, okay.
Briggs
Payne.
Payne. We had a similar discrepancy with Payne's biography. So we said, this is what Payne said about himself. This is what I was able to find. Same thing here. This is what C.T.O. King said. This is what I was able to find.
All right. So for
So
the
we'll leave it
record,
at that.
C.T.O. King said, I was born in Moretown, but actually he wasn't. He was born in present day Nigeria and taken to recapture as a and taken to Moretown.
Yeah. So
Okay.
one of those two is true. And I'll just leave it up to others to determine which one they want to believe.
Mm-hmm.
But the conventional historic narrative is that he was born in Moretown, because that is what he said.
Good. But he himself never said he was a miracle Liberian, as we see being reported on
No,
in the news on social media.
eh, no, he never did. And even
No.
his descendants, no, but his descendants are, of course, because there've been intermarriages.
Yeah.
But the apex of their legacy, of their dynasty, was not.
Thank you. There is
So
nothing now.
before you read this, I just want to give a little background. So this is
Okay.
all I'm going to say about C.T.O. King for this. And the purpose of this is to kind of give people an understanding of who Charles came from, the kind of mindset that his father had. And so therefore, who was Charles? Who was this? Whenever we do the genealogy and of these presidents, and we talk about their backgrounds, is to set up a scenario for why they behaved the way they did when they were in office. You have President Johnson. He is the son of the founder of Liberian sovereignty, really, and so you have this whole behavior that stems from, I have to make my father proud. In this particular case, I want you to read a little excerpt from the mind of C.T.O. King. And then we'll get into his son Charles, and then we can do a contrast or a comparison.
It reads, there is nothing now to be feared when it is acknowledged on all sides that the world is growing better. The whole world believes we are somebody, notwithstanding Victor Hugo's advice to Europe to go in and take Africa as there was nobody there. The whole world believes that we are somebody, but they seem to wish to put it off, or they keep trying to do so. And we too have learned to speak in the same manner ourselves, hence the motto, Africa shall rise. This is owing to our being brought up in their schools and having imbibed many of their ideas and ways of thinking. So hurtful a thing it is to have been brought up in Egypt, a cursed circumstance, as we have read over and over in the Israelite history, so that nation was never able to rid itself of the fatal effects of it. And indeed, disgrace and ruin brought the curse of providence down on them, so that they were finally dispersed, and they have not been able to gather themselves together even unto this day, as to be able to say that both land and people are an acknowledged fact. Our motto in Africa shall be Africa forever, that Africa will stand at the last days, as when in the first days, the beginning of her kingdoms, Babel and Erech and Akkad and Canaan, in the land of the, I don't
Of
see,
Shinar, of
Shinar.
the land of Shinar.
Hmm.
So him being brought up in these schools, but knowing of his greatness as an Abado man, he was conscious. He went back to his place of birth. He created a sovereign state in what later became part of Nigeria. This man was no joke when it came to having a liberated mind and understanding the world. I want you to think about how profound this is. He wrote this in the 19th century. He wrote this in the 1800s. He said, the motto Africa shall rise is a disgrace. It should be Africa forever, meaning that we are somebody, we've always been somebody. It's not that we're nothing and rising to be something. You must remember that you have always been somebody, and it should be Africa forever. This was profound. This was profound thought at this period in history. This was a man who suffered unthinkably in his childhood. He saw the destruction of his empire by the Dahomeans, who sold his people in great numbers into slavery, some of whom were liberated from slave ships and repatriated to Liberia and Sierra Leone. The Agbado were some of the greatest numbers of people who were sold into slavery after the transatlantic slave trade was abolished because of the Dahomey Empire. So this man was a proud Africanist. This man did not believe the lie of white supremacy and African inferiority, which if you believe one, you must believe the other. He refutes this in the statement. And he connects Africa to the most ancient times. Our motto in Africa should be Africa forever, that Africa will stand at the last days as it did in the first days. That's powerful.
Yeah. Africa shall rise suggests that you are down. Somebody put you down, you are rising. It should be
Not
Africa.
even that you've just always been down.
Yeah.
Because it's not even Africa shall rise again. It's Africa shall rise. This is a defeated motto. This is an acceptance of lies told by conquerors to those they've conquered. When you erase people's history, you can fill them with anything, as was done with us in Liberia. When you erase people's history, you can fill them with anything. Another thing that he says in this snippet, I mean, this entire letter he wrote is much more. I'll see if I can post it so you can share with your audience. But he talked about the brainwashing that occurs in our education system.
Right. And he referenced the Bible, right?
Yeah, because education, Christianity, civilization, all the same at this period in history. right? So if you're going to school to be westernized or civilized, as they called it, you were going to be doing so through a Christian path. So this is why most of our 19th and early 20th century scholars were very biblical. Their analogies were biblical. Their thought process was biblical. Not only ours, but the whole world was very religious in the way that they expressed scholarship and philosophy. So this is why he's making reference to this. But he profoundly was able to escape the systematic brainwashing that taught us that we were not part of this process of developing humanity. He understood differently because he remembered where he came from, and he remembered what he grew up understanding. When this man came to Liberia, he brought with him such a strong sense of dignity. But I bring up the school thing because while he had all of this understanding, and he had a lot of respect because he had this understanding, he had a son who he loved and cherished and did not want his son to suffer as he had. He married a westernized, recaptured African and a very Christian woman. They had Charles, our 17th president, sent him to schools that were going to shape his mindset. Charles lived a soft life. His father, from the previous slide, was extremely successful. He was trading. He was a merchant trading in coffee. He was mayor of Monrovia. He was like the customs commissioner, basically. He was the agent for the American Colonization Society. He did all of these wonderful things. So his son didn't have to feel any hardship. Next slide, please.
Carl, before we go to that, something just flashed to my mind. Like C.T.O. King came from Sierra Leone to Liberia, and he right there he became, he did a lot of things. Right, he was a postmaster, he was judge, he was this, he was that. I mean, what was it like that time coming from Sierra Leone to be Liberian? Was it and I want to bring that up because if I look at that today, if somebody maybe was it automatic citizenship, was it a process, or we were looking for blacks to just assemble in Liberia? So wherever you came from, automatically you blended in. Was it like that?
Every Liberia, if you look at our constitution, every African in the entire world was a Liberian citizen. Liberia was an asylum for African people. So whether you be from, and this is something that we need to really understand about our early history.
Yeah, that's why I brought it up.
If you read the 1847 Constitution, Liberia is an asylum for the oppressed children of Africa. So this idea that indigenous people were not citizens, this other group was not citizens, it's impossible. It's a confusion that occurs later. It is a confusion that does not even occur until much later. It's voluntary. If you come from the Ma Empire in what is now Guinea and northern Liberia, and you want to be Liberian and you move into the Liberian controlled territory, you are a Liberian. Nobody say you're not Liberian, get off of yet. Because that was what it was.
But you had to go through steps, right? You had to be Christianized, you had to be educated, or Westernized.
There's nothing in the Constitution that says you have to be educated to be Liberian. There was nothing in the Constitution that said you had to be Christian to be Liberian.
Right.
So we should not confuse 1847 with 1822. The Commonwealth of Liberia was not the Republic of Liberia. And the Republic of Liberia ended the Commonwealth and its laws. The Commonwealth was a Christian settlement. It had all these rules. In the Liberian Constitution, they did not say Liberian was a Christian nation.
Right.
Nor did they say you had to be Christian to be Liberian. Though all of the presidents and the leaders were Christian, because again, Westernization, Christianized, and education, all of those things were intertwined. That being said, there was nothing that said you had to be a descendant of African Americans to be Christian. There's a difference between laws and cultural pressure to assimilate. Everybody wants to be elite. Everybody wants to be part of the elite class. The concept of being descendant of an African American was prestigious because Elijah Johnson, Hillary Teague, these were the people that established the republic, all the early presidential heroes. So even though there was this fight within Truett Party for recaptured Africans and indigenous people to take over the party, which they did, beginning with President Arthur Barkley and all those that came after him, until we get to Tubman. So every president that came after, from Arthur Barkley all the way to Edmund Barkley, was not descendant of African Americans because there was a bit of a pushback. But the Liberians who were educated and controlling the government were mostly, they were the so-called descendants of African Americans, which people in Tubman later on refuted this term, Americo-Liberian. Those people that descended from African Americans were actually not in the majority that were in control of the government. You have a population that is very intermarried by the time we reach about 1930, the end of King's presidency. King himself was married to a descendant of an African American. So you've got a lot of intermarriage, intermingling. Howard was married to, a descendant of African American. J.J. Dosen, the Chief Justice, was married to Ferguson's daughter. So there was much mixing going on. So even the indigenous people that rose to power would take wives from, the prestigious class.
Thank you. I have more questions there, but let's move forward before we're sidetracked.
Okay.
Oh.
That brings us to Charles Dunbar Burgess King, 12 March 1875 to 4 September 1961. Education, Trinity Parish School, Missionary Baptist School in Sierra Leone. Law apprentice under Chief Justice F.E.R. Johnson. Early career, County Attorney, Attorney General under President Barkley. Secretary of State under President Daniel Howard.
Yes.
Further information, he was a Grand Master of the Masons of Liberia, and then after he serves his presidency, he's Liberian Ambassador to the United States, and then he's going to be Liberian Ambassador to the United Nations. So he's going to have stuff afterwards when he gets...
this is just his early career. Yep. This is his career before becoming president.
And he also was at Liberia College as well. Let's not forget about that as well. He had his part.
Yeah, I don't know if he graduated from Liberia College, though. Did you find that he graduated from Liberia College? Because I couldn't. That's why I left it off.
Okay. I saw speculation on that he was in Liberia College, but they didn't really go in depth, so I'm not.
Yeah, and he was ambassador to the United States, not the UN.
Okay.
Oh, United States. Yeah, and his grandson, CDB.
Oh,
wow. Hey, what's up,
Coach King?
Yeah, that's Coach King, his grandson.
It's good you turned in late. Late. Wasn't watching from the beginning because I thought that was going to be his comment.
No, he joined like 8:57.
Okay, after we had started. How you doing, Coach?
And unlike other presidents, so we are getting closer now. So we are seeing the generation of some of these presidents. So
right, people who actually knew him, right? So all the presidents that we talked about, for the most part, except one or two of them, have living descendants in Liberia. So, but they're so far removed because of how long ago it was. They don't have a personal connection. It's not their grandfather or great-grandfather. It's an ancestor, right? So once you get past great-grandfather, it's like it's some ambiguous ancestor. But with President King, there are people living who sat on his lap, who he might have read stories to or scolded for doing the wrong thing. So, here's a beautiful picture of his wife and his son, Cecil, in Germany. Sorry, this photo was taken in Germany. So
Man got
Has
swag. I will give him that. That's the if there's only one thing he's good at, he got swag. That's one thing he do have.
So again, this is a very pampered. I would say of all of the Liberian presidents, he is the most pampered up to this point. Like he lived the softest life. He had the most even, I mean, Elijah Johnson was not a rich man, he was a prominent and prestigious man. So his son didn't grow up with the kind of wealth and privilege that Charles D.B. King grew up with. C.T.O. King amassed quite a comfortable life for himself and his family. You don't have that with any of the previous presidents. All of those presidents who were wealthy before becoming president were self-made. I mean, you might argue that E.J. Roy, you know, his father set him up pretty nicely, but he still worked to amass his own wealth. Before emigrating to Liberia, he took what his father was doing and he took it to another level. Daniel B. Warner, born in abject poverty, went to Liberia in abject poverty. Stephen Allen Benson, born, you know, in abject poverty, went to Liberia basically as a 6-year-old. Suffered, was kidnapped by King Peter Brumley's people and taken into captivity by King Peter Brumley in the day, all of these guys had horrible things to overcome, challenges, real struggles and suffering. Charles D.B. King is the only president I've studied that did not have any of those kinds of challenges. His childhood was pretty prestigious for an African person at that period in history. His father, because of all of that knowledge that we talked about that he had and that kind of dignity for himself, he wanted his children to experience the best possible life, free of any kind of hardship. He provided a soft landing for his son. And also because of who C.T.O. King was, Charles was now everyone, oh, this is C.T.O. King's son. His father was so powerful. His father was so intelligent, was so respected, that Charles not only had the soft financial life, the comforts, he also had the privilege that goes along with his father's legacy, his father's name, also carried him. And every single president we've done, we try to get into their mindset to understand, why was this guy like this? But for me, this really breaks it down and why he was just like, why am I struggling and hurting my head over these people? Because he didn't know struggle. He didn't know hardship. That's, again, my opinion, but it's my informed opinion based on the reasons I just discussed.
Thank you. And Coach King said, I knew him. I stayed with him. He used to take me around, traveling with him. So that's good.
There you
Thank
go.
you.
So we just,
First-hand account.
Yeah. Man, we should have had Coach King do this with us. He could personal stuff.
Coach,
this
please,
is more of
anything you can add, please do.
And please call in and tell us some anecdotal stories and stuff like that. That would be good. So here's a picture from a German publication from 1927. There's gonna be, look, this was Dapper Dan, Pretty Boy King. This guy knew material luxury. He understood how to carry himself. He'd be in a room with, some of the most wealthy and prominent people in the world, and he outshined them, outdressed them, outswagged them.
Yeah, you can see the swag.
And
I told you, if
pretentious.
there's only one thing good about Charles King, is he got swag. I gotta admit, that swag is on point.
So and the thing here is, yes, this pretentious, it was not forced. This is actually who he was. Sometimes people, the nouveau riche, they like to get up and overdo things because they want to prove something. This is who he was. This is that soft life his father provided for him. He didn't know any different.
Yeah.
So it wouldn't even occur to him to not carry and conduct himself in the most prim and proper manner possible. No president before him, and I will argue no president after him, had the kind of privilege that he had.
Let's see more pictures then.
Yeah. So here's another one. You know, he's in. This is again in Germany. All these pictures, the three pictures were taken in Germany, and this is 1927. This is while he's president. He's still relatively young. He's he's moving and shaking. I just wanted to share those pictures before we get into some of the controversy here and kind of talk about. But I wanted to set up the psychology, right? This is a person who more identifies with Harvey Firestone than he would with with Dennis Ja or Jabari Lamb. Yeah, because again, I would even argue this is a man that would more identify with Harvey Firestone than even his own father, because not much of his father's mindset is expressed in the choices he made when he became president. Although it was people who studied literally at his father's feet, Daniel Howard, Arthur Bartlett, who empowered him into positions of prestige while they were president. So the two presidents that preceded him and empowered him were men who looked up to his father and were mentored and inspired by his father. Men who were Pan-Africanists and Garveyites. Even F.E.R. Johnson, which is a descendant of Elijah Johnson, who was the head of UNIA for all of Africa, the United Negro Improvement Association, which was Garvey's organization. It was F.E.R. Johnson who taught, or Charles D.B. King apprenticed under for law. So this is really important. And he didn't think like them. It's like almost like they didn't rub off on him. Mm-hmm. Next slide, please. So one of the things that I found interesting and about that kind of expresses in a nutshell Charles D.B. King's disconnect from Africa and considering himself basically a global citizen, just being more part, he more aligned himself with the concept of European imperialism than he did with African liberation struggle. One of the things that solidified this for me in my mind was his role during the peace conference which led to the Treaty of Versailles in France at the end of World War I. But I'll go ahead and we'll get into it. Go ahead, Dennis.
King was the last surviving signatory to the Treaty of Versailles. This was a peace document signed at the end of World War I by the Allied and Associated Powers and by Germany in the Hall of Mirrors in the Palace of Versailles, France, on June 28, 1919.
So
it took force on January 10, 1920.
Yeah. So this is what he should be in the Guinness Book of World Records for, not the lie that they made up about the. So one of the things that I didn't even do a slide about it because I was just so annoyed with this biggest lie ever told on a Liberian president. Well, they told a lot of lies on a lot of our presidents, but he did not. That Guinness Book of World Records thing that was no source cited in 1985, and it's just been repeated. And this is how lies get repeated throughout time, and then they become accepted as conventional history. This is a prime example. Accusing somebody of rigging an election without any evidence, no primary sources, no election data, nothing to back up the claim. So disprove that. It is not true. He did not. If he rigged the election, they don't have any evidence that he did. And I wasn't able to find any. Guinness Book of World Records does not cite any sources. And everyone after 1985, after the 80s, just continues to repeat this without reference to any primary source. This is dangerous, and this is what happens repeatedly with Liberian history. The complete disrespect of our history, that you can just cite second and third sources without even going back to the primary source or verifying or getting something to corroborate it. So the Treaty of Versailles is something that no other Liberian president would have, previous to him, I believe, would have signed off on. I do not believe that any of his predecessors would have signed this treaty. It is important to the Allied powers. It was not really good for Africa. And as we discussed earlier, Liberia was established for African people. Next slide, please.
Yeah, so the Treaty of Versailles was signed by President King. You said this should have gone in the Guinness Book of Record, right?
No, what should have gone there is that he was the last surviving signatory. That is a record, right? He was the last surviving signatory to the treaty.
Right. But
that's significant.
Right. And you said what we have in the Guinness Book of Records that he rigged the election out of, and I'm going to miss the numbers here, out of 45, out of 15,000 registered voters, he won 45,000, and his competitor or his opponent won 9,000. You said that's a lie.
I'm saying that there's absolutely no evidence that that's true. It's a claim without any evidence to support the claim. Made, to sensationalize, something. Most of the time, these, and it just took on a life of its own. There's absolutely nothing. Even the original source does not cite where they got it from. And it was way in 1985 when they published that the original citation in the Guinness Book of World Records. But where did they get the information from? They don't cite any sources. Right. No newspaper articles from that time period that I was able to the New York Times, all of the African American publications from that year, nothing corroborating this. No records from Liberia corroborating this. I mean, if this had been true, it would have been so scandalous, it would have been published somewhere at the time.
But was there any report on that election? Say, hey, today.
Yes, there were the reports on the election. Of course, the New York Times reports on the election.
And what did it say?
It just simply said he won. But, nobody talks about landslide victory. There's nothing even close to corroborating this. They talk about the contest between him and Faulkner. Charles D.B. King was elected for the very first time in 1919. He took office in 1920. 1919, he was elected. He stayed in office until 1930, serving consecutive terms. He was elected initially again because he was C.T.O. King's son. And he carried himself, among people who were trying to pass the torch on to him. Barclay, Howard, and all of these people. Where they come up with this story, I don't know. But this is these are some of the things that the bad press that tries to turn Liberia into kind of like a buffoon story. And we should be very careful when we read these kind of buffoonish accounts about our country.
Right. I mean, it's very important, right? Because this is history that I was taught, and really, I didn't think about it, from a source perspective to say, well, what did newspapers say at that time? Did they publish the total number, at least the percentage?
And Dennis, in all fairness, do you know why you never thought about it? It's because no other country that I can think of has a history that's completely, buried, and then they have this fabrication legacy of fabricated legacy of history that's been carrying, for a couple of generations. There's no way that Ghana would have a story about an election being rigged and they wouldn't have evidence of it and be teaching that to their children and allow that kind of lie to be spread around the world about their country.
Because every quotation is about the Guinness Book of Record. I've not seen any
Yeah,
quotation.
and that responsibility, I don't believe even falls on the King family. It falls on the Liberian government to say, wait a minute, where did this come from? Prove it or delete this. Lie, retract it. That's the Liberian government. That's why we have an embassy here. Challenge this and say, look, this is a lie about our country. He's an American publication putting out false, buffoonish information about our country. Retract this statement. Publicly retract it because it's not true.
The only evidence, not even evidence, is word of mouth from that time came from the United States that they said it was rigged. That it came from the U.S. There's no evidence in Liberia that the election was rigged. It was fabricated by some American, and they said, "Oh well, he had more votes than there were voters," and we just ran with it.
I haven't even seen that. All I saw was a Guinness book. And they didn't cite any sources. I reached out to them and asked for sources. It's been 3 weeks, nothing. Crickets.
And you ain't gonna get anything.
Oh, all right, let's.
So I'm going to focus a little bit on the treaty. We're going to try to get through this, but the treaty required Germany to compensate Allied powers. This is some of the things I want you to think about, and think about all the other presidents whose biographies we've done. In the context of Africa, as an African man, going and saying and identifying with the Allied powers as opposed to identifying with Africa. And signing off on something that's really not good for Africa. But go ahead, Dennis.
The treaty required Germany to compensate the Allied powers. The final reparations sum of 132 billion gold marks to be demanded of all the Central Powers. This was the public assessment of what the Central Powers combined could pay, and was also a compromise between Belgian, British, and French demands and assessments. Furthermore, the Commission recognized that the Central Powers could pay little and that the burden would fall upon Germany. As a result, the sum was split into different categories, of which Germany was only required to pay 50 billion gold marks, that is US $12.5 billion. This being the genuine assessment of the Commission on what Germany could pay, and allow the Allied powers to save face with the public by presenting a higher figure. Furthermore, payments made between 1919 and 1921 were
taken into account, reducing the sum to 41 billion gold marks. So, and then over here in the red, the treaty did not require Germany to pay reparations for killing over 65,000 unarmed Herero civilians in the Namib Desert and tens of thousands in their other African colonies, including damage that Germany caused to Liberia. There was no agreement for reparations there either. This was all about paying Europe and the United States, compensating Europeans and their descendants, and completely ignoring the fact that Germany had all of these colonies where they had massacred people, and in the Namib Desert literally committed genocide against the Herero, marched them into the desert and killed them. 65,000 people killed in just a matter of weeks.
And so how did President King get to sign up on this?
Because he was wanting to be part of the people that he identified and aligned himself with. This is a World War I treaty, and you know, like, we participated in World War I under Howard. We talked about that when we talked about President Howard. He was Secretary of State at the time, and so that's why he was there to sign this. He was there to represent Liberia at the conference. Then he ends up being signatory to the treaty. Made absolutely no comments on record about, hey, this is, you know, inappropriate. I'm representing Africa here. What about us? Absolutely nothing on record in defense of Africa and the crimes Germany committed against Africa.
What, was he probably the only African there?
Yes. So at this period, there's Liberia and Ethiopia, right? And then you've got Ethiopia, which is basically subjugated by Italy at this very moment. And so you've got Haiti, you've got Liberia.
So
the treaty besides impact on Africa, basically the key thing you need to know about this is that Germany is going to lose all of its colonies. Originally, they were Cameroon, they were Tanganyika, which today we call Tanzania, and then German Southwest Africa, also Togoland, which is today Togo, and then Southwest Africa is Namibia. So Article 119 required Germany to renounce sovereignty over all its former colonies. Article 22 converted the territories into a League of Nations mandate under the control of allied states. Togoland and German Cameroon, today we spell Cameroon, were transferred to France, aside from portions given to Britain, British Togoland, and British Cameroon. Rwanda and Burundi were allocated to Belgium. German Southwest Africa was sent to South Africa. British obtained German East Africa, and as compensation for the German invasion of Portuguese Africa, Portugal was granted the Kionga Triangle, a sliver of German East Africa in northern Mozambique.
So this map, I don't know if you want to blow it up a little bit for people, but this is a map from the time period. So all the dark areas at the top, of course, in this peninsula that we call Europe, that little dark spot was Germany. And these are Germany's colonies in Africa. Being turned over, not to Africans to govern themselves, as all the previous Liberian presidents would have did on African sovereignty. They're saying Germany should relinquish their sovereignty over these places and give it to other European powers. So the acceptance of colonialism, the failure to speak in the language of Liberians of the past, and just go along without, even if dissent would have been fallen on deaf ears, it should have been a matter of record. As all the previous presidents, even going back to J.J. Roberts, had done, which is speak of the importance of African sovereignty for African people and our right to self-governance. This is that moment, that turning point in Liberian history, where it's the first time we're seeing a Liberian president not feel that he is representing the interests of African people. This is the first time in history that we're seeing a Liberian president, or even, a Secretary of State at the time. He was elected actually that same year, but he didn't go there and represent Howard or UNIA. The president who made him Secretary of State was an African freedom fighter. He was a Pan-Africanist. He believed in African liberation. His signature to this document, without any dissent, without any raising any controversy, without saying anything, was the polar opposite of what Liberian foreign policy was at the time. And it was not even until he returned and he had already been elected that the details of this treaty were made available to the Liberian legislature.
Moving on.
Any questions on there?
Yeah, I mean, I'm thinking here, in the face of superpowers, what could President King do? Just play along, just like we do today. African leaders do today. We go at the UN and president say, okay, wherever America votes, that's where we're going to vote, right?
Again, he's the first person to ever do that.
Okay. So he set
I
the stage.
mean, Talbert didn't do that. Edwin Barclay, who immediately succeeded him, did not do that.
But what did they face? What did Barclay face and he didn't do it?
When we get to Barclay, we'll talk about it. But Barclay stood up for Liberian sovereignty because they were trying to take our country and annex it because of some of the blunders during the King administration. And Barclay stood firm, like his uncle Arthur, and defended the sovereignty of the Republic of Liberia. That was the last great courageous act in defense of our sovereignty. Was Edwin Barclay.
Thank you. And call people are enjoying what we're doing here. So Kerry say, wonderful platform. You all do a great job on discussing Liberia history from all angles. And say through our super chat donated $10. Thank you.
Thank you, Say.
Back to our lecture.
So, I mean, you know the tremendous challenges that were faced before was far worse. The world was far much more difficult, in the 1800s for African people than in 1920, right? So this idea that he couldn't say anything, even if they had not listened, just for the record, make a statement, which is what all his predecessors had done, which is what his own father had done.
I want to get in this because this. If you want to know where my venom comes from Mr. Charlie. This is where it's going to come from. So, in the summer of 1924, the pressure from the British and French, who governed the territory surrounding Liberia, took effect. The Liberian government under Charles E.B. King sent a diplomatic note to the United States announcing that it was irrevocably opposed, both in principle and in fact, to the incendiary policies of the Universal Negro Improvement Association headed by Marcus Garvey. The land promised to Garvey were leased instead to Firestone Rubber Company, and when new Garvey missions arrived, the members were arrested for immediate deportation. Thereupon, the Liberian president was lionized by the British for his courage and statesmanship. The British press hailed him for putting his foot down very firmly on such misguided movements for the people of his own race as that sponsored by Marcus Garvey and other agitators. Now, before we get to that, Mr. King, President King, Mr. Charlie King, went to the United States and he said, His Excellency C.D.B. King, the President of the Republic of Liberia, has fulfilled the mission of his visit to the United States of America. And with other commissions of his convoy who accompany the Liberian executive, has made his return to his home in West Africa. President King was a recipient of many high honors in America during his sojourn upon our shores. Okay? He said, and I want y'all to hear this, when he was speaking to a room of black people, he was officially received by our own president at the time, President Warren G. Harding, in the name of the government of the United States of America. He, President King, was officially and formally received by the Honorable Mayor of the city of Philadelphia. Afterwards, President King accepted an invitation to attend a banquet given in his honor by black people in Philadelphia. There, with more than 50,000 in attendance, 50,000 folks are attending this, y'all. He showers them with honor, and the president says that Liberia is to be an open door to the thrifty, the industrious, the upright colored men and women who desire to come into this country. So he's telling you right there beforehand, before he makes a 180, we want you to come here. You're welcome in here. And originally he does that with the UNIA. Hey, come in here, because everybody at the time were for it. You had those same
I
people.
want to I want to come in 1 second, Jabari. This was done when he was Secretary of State and he was carrying out Daniel E. Howard's policy.
Mm-hmm.
So I just want to point that out. So he's doing these things when he's representing Howard, correct?
Yes.
So we have to distinguish between Charles D.B. King,
As president.
the Secretary of State, who is a appointee of President Howard, who is a staunch UNIA member and supporter, as opposed to King as a president when he's setting his own policy. That's all I wanted to say. So I just want to make sure we're on the same page, because the 180 happens when he becomes president. Secretary King, different from President King, because now his true colors are coming out. His own beliefs are coming out. That's all I wanted to point out. I could be,
I wanted to make that known. He was all for it, even early on. He was like, okay, I welcome the UNIA, Barclay. And actually, that was in 1922, because, of course, Warren G. Harding, 1922. So this is the early formative years of his presidency.
Okay, I got you. That's true.
He was like, yeah, y'all can come home. The UNIA, you welcome. We got the land and all that for you. And then when the British and French give him an ounce of pushback, no, ma'am. No, sir. Y'all got to leave. Y'all got to leave. Mr. Firestone, y'all can come on in. And then when he gives his philosophy, Dennis Shaw, if you can go into the next slide. If you can't go into the next slide. In 1927, when independent Negro country was a curiosity in Africa, Mr. King discussed his philosophy. Thus, I am working for Liberia, not for the black race. It was there before Liberia. It is an indestructible thing, whereas nationality needs fostering. And with this advancement, the black race automatically advances. I am for keeping the young colored men of my country at home.
So this was put into the presentation for a very important reason. And when we started this, you asked a very powerful question. You said, why is it anyone could just go to Liberia? Why could C.T.O. King just go to Liberia and set up shop? Because the Liberia was a republic created specifically for that purpose. Liberia was specifically created for that purpose as an asylum for African people to escape oppression. It was set up specifically for the purpose of repatriating Africans abroad and Africans on the continent who had been displaced, and creating kind of a free of colonialism, free of imperialism, a place where African people could be independent, self-determinate beings like everyone else in the world. This statement that was made in 1927 by Charles D.B. King grossly deviates from the purpose for which the country was established. This is the first time in Liberian history that a president deviates from the founding principles of the country. I'm the president working for Liberia, not for the black race. It is a contradiction, because the purpose of Liberia, as it was established in the 1847 Constitution, it meant that the Liberian president was actually the president for all free black people. That is really what that meant. So Liberia was supposed to be that shining star of sovereignty for black people, because the whole world was subjugated. Even in 1927, when he's making the point, Liberia is still trying to survive and attain its initial purpose, its original goal. Everyone in the world had fought Liberia from 1847 to this point to prevent Liberia from manifesting its documented constitutional destiny. Charles is now coming in and saying, to heck with that destiny. I'm more concerned with being a Liberian. I don't care about black people.
Right. Carl, if you don't know, if you are like me who don't know the whole context, you would think this is super nationalism, right?
Right.
And
But
why would
it's
you be wrong?
nationalism if you don't know your country, and that's one of the things. If you don't know your country, if you don't, this is why civics education. Americans in the United States, everyone knows this is an immigrant country. They encourage immigration. That's what makes America great. Everybody can come here. Give us your tired, your weary, your struggling masses striving to be free. Your humble masses striving to be free. They. This is Liberia is that for African people, because that manifesto of the United States was not for Black people, it was for Europeans. So Liberia becomes that manifesto for African people.
Mm-hmm.
And he's saying, we don't want that for African people. We just want that for us in Liberia. So this is an extreme situation of how class and privilege can not always the case, but can misalign you from having a sense of racial identity.
Yeah. And I mean, I wonder what C.T.O. King, his father, would say to this.
And I want to get into that because that's also going to contrast him with his father. C.T.O. King, when there were Black people coming in, he would help assist them. He would help make sure they were settled. He would make sure that immigrants were getting accustomed into the culture, especially in the 1890s when he was working with the American Colonization Society. Whereas you have here with King, he goes and he says, "Hey, originally, well, I want you guys here. You Black people can come here." And then to do a 180 in betrayal to these people after you've made these promises, you've made these negotiations with no warning, to turn your back on these people when they looked up to this country for this reason is the epitome of betrayal. It is the epitome of cowardice. And so I think his father would be disappointed, really disappointed that I was willing to help. I was willing to make sure that people had a better life. And you decided to focus on your own needs, what suited best for you, rather than the collective as a whole.
And Jabari said when he did this deportation, he was actually honored by the British.
That should tell
Right.
you everything about that should tell you everything. If the British and the French and the Americans were lauding you and saying you're doing a good job, that means it is detrimental to African people. That means he is
So
doing something that is detrimental to African people.
So, so the,
I want you guys to remember that when we talked about Arthur Berkeley and the British thinking that he was a British subject, they thought that Arthur Berkeley was going to do what Howard eventually did. I'm not Howard. I'm sorry. What King eventually did. If you go back to the Arthur Berkeley episode, we talked about how they wrongly believed that he was going to somehow uh, think like an Englishman, Arthur Berkeley. And Arthur Berkeley didn't think like an Englishman. Arthur Berkeley thought like an African. And so here you have an African who is not, of a descendant of people who were enslaved in America or the Caribbean, thinking like an Englishman. So what the British expected that Arthur Berkeley would be, because he was born in Barbados, and then they were wrong. He was a avid Pan-Africanist. You have in Charles D.B. King what they essentially had wanted to see in and the Europeans and English Americans were happy when the True Whig Party flipped away from descendants of African Americans and started allowing Caribbean and recaptured African descendants to be president, because and Bassa, right, and indigenous people to be president, because they thought that the African Americans were more radically Pan-Africanist because of their experience in the United States and that legacy. So they thought Arthur Berkeley, then they thought, oh, Howard, because they had a better relationship with indigenous people. But Howard ended up being a militant Pan-Africanist. Then they did everything they could do They were trying to get rid of they were supporting Howard against J.J. Dosen, but then Howard ended up being radical too. So Charles D.B. King was a gift to European imperialism because he believed in their ideology. Charles didn't think he was being wicked. He thought he was. A lot of people today believe in European imperialism. They think it's the right thing.
Yeah.
They want to identify with that. So it doesn't mean that he was, not very smart or that's just his belief system. And I really attribute that to the way he was brought up. I could be wrong, but in my opinion, that shaped his mindset. He considered himself a part of that capitalist imperialist class and more readily identified with that, had less empathy for the masses of people who were suffering, and didn't think it was his problem, frankly, to worry about them.
That's why that radical Pan-Africanism is what drew people like Howard and Barclay and Dosen to the UNIA to collaborate with them, because they had the same ideology and goals.
As the Republic of Liberia. I mean, UNIA basically came out of Liberia. If you really want to talk about Garvey's idea, Garvey's mentors were early Liberians. Garvey was a student of early Liberians. So it's not that they just, that Marcus Garvey himself was a student of those early Liberian radicals. So there would be no UNIA if there wasn't a Liberia. Marcus Garvey cited Liberian radicals in his ideology and his philosophy, and that's why he connected to Liberia, because that's what awakened him.
But now, if you see the British, the French, American honoring you, then there's a problem. Just like they say, if monkey gives you banana, just imagine how many in your stomach. We also want to take time off and say thank you to Elvis Morris. He contributed $20 because $20.
Thanks, Elvis.
And it didn't stop there. So Moses said, well, you can beat me. This is my favorite show on YouTube. I'm giving $10. I mean, we just appreciate it.
Wow, thanks, guys.
Yes.
So there's a whole thing about before you read this, I just wanted to talk a little bit about. I took some of these slides out because I didn't want the show to be too long. But during this period, this is the precursor to the Cold War. There's a lot of issues coming up towards the middle and around the time Firestone's coming. You've got George Padmore from the Caribbean, who is a radical communist, African descendant. George Padmore, not related, as far as I know, to the Padmores of Liberia, but he was a radical Africanist, and he was a staunch enemy of Charles D.B. King and W.B. Du Bois. He felt that these people were traitors to the working class, to the masses of African people. He expressed his disdain, his anger for Charles D.B. King when he was interviewed by the New York Times, and he was asked, if Liberia tolerated communism, right at the time when McCarthy and all of these people are coming up with their anti-communist rhetoric. And he made a point to say that Liberia, there are no red men in Liberia, meaning there's no communists in Liberia, only black and white. Charles D.B. King said there's no red in Liberia, only black and white, meaning Liberia is for black and white people, not for communists. It's for black and white capitalists, not for communists. I mean, though our Constitution in 1847, as it was written, does not talk about capitalism, communism as ideologies, because it's 1847 and those ideologies had not been articulated yet. but it's clearly a black country. Charles D.B. King is staunchly anti-communist. He's anti-Pan-African, extremely, I won't even use the word conservative, because my mentor, Dr. Alkati, used to always say, what are you trying to conserve? If you're an African person, you're not conservative if you're hanging out with white conservatives. You're trying to conserve their privilege, not assert your own. So so when you're an African and you're allying or aligning yourself with imperialists that step on Africans, that's not being conservative at all. You're not conserving your own legacy or your own dignity. You are joining the ranks of your enemies and bearing arms against your own people, ideologically, really. And so he was, in his mind, more aligned with Western imperialism, and he was very much articulating every opportunity that he had to do so, his disdain for any movement that would lift the working class or the enslaved or oppressed masses out of poverty. Again, attributing, in my mind, to his extremely privileged upbringing and not really adopting the ideologies of his father, but more of the lifestyle he was raised with.
All of the statements made at Williamstown were based on my report to the Harvard Bureau of International Research entitled The Native Problem in Africa, published in May 1928. Before publication, the Liberian manuscript was submitted to the State Department. While dissenting vigorously from the conclusion and interpretation, the department representative specifically challenged only one fact, which I therefore omitted. The manuscript was also checked by 3 other persons in first-hand touch with Liberia. The only reason that I enter into this detail is that Mr. Castle and President King have challenged my accuracy and disinterestedness. Despite the length of their statements, neither Mr. Castle nor President King meets any of my fundamental contentions. In fact, their statements contradict each other. If the public is to form a judgment, the State Department should publish not only the text of the loan, but what?
But all the correspondence and cables in regard to Liberia during the last 5 years.
We're talking Firestone now.
Yeah. So there's much been written about Firestone and Fernando Po labor crisis. But here you have, oh, sorry, I forgot to cite this slide. This is actually Buell, who was an American who did an investigation on this and published a huge paper. So this is an excerpt from that. When the US government and the Liberian government tried to push back, he came out and said, no, this is what I'm asserting, and here are my facts. He claimed that, in fact, Firestone themselves wanted 1 million, workers, basically, to work in their, I'm not sorry, not 1 million workers, 2 million workers to work on the 1 million acre plantation. They literally wanted to just enslave the entire country to Firestone. Buell, in his report, expressed the forced labor, the horrific conditions at Firestone. People died in the rainforest, clearing an ancient rainforest with literally their bare hands and hand tools. They were forcibly removed from their homes and taken into the rainforest to clear this place. Within the rainforest, you had clans and people who were living there. They were displaced. Some of these people had decided, their children went on and moved into Liberian controlled areas and had become Liberian. They tried to contest this and say, hey, my ancestral town back there where my grandparents were from, has been completely demolished by this Firestone project. There were already people there. I mean, it was a huge thing. They were complaining to their legislatures. The situation was terrible. And there was absolutely no plan to compensate people for being displaced from their land by Firestone or the Liberian government. On the contrary, those who were displaced, in order to remain there, were forced into labor agreements with Firestone. There was such a labor shortage, they went as far as the newly penetrated territory of the north and central part of Liberia and drew those people into work by force. They created this whole Fernando Po labor crisis fiasco to offset the fact that they didn't want people going to Fernando Po because they wanted to force labor for Firestone. That was what really fueled all of this. Because as we had said in the forced labor presentation we did, conditions at Firestone were worse than Fernando Po at this period in history.
Carl, you just mentioned something very significant. In fact, two things. The Firestone, the land was 1 million acres, right? And they needed 2 million workers. And Liberia's population.
That's what they had. That's what Bill claims.
And Liberia's population, I don't think it was up to.
It wasn't. So if you have to think about that, they're thinking about drawing people from Liberia. Didn't have that many. They wanted to draw people from other parts of Africa too.
Yeah.
From surrounding areas. Remember, they have allyship with the British and the French. They were trying to really. They never ended up developing the entire 1 million acres, but that was their goal.
That's the goal.
But they did succeed in using Liberian human beings to forcibly clear the rainforest and build the largest, at that time, the largest plantation in human history.
And
without any machines, without any mechanized farming.
We've heard a lot about Fernando Po. You're saying the conditions at Firestone were far worse than Fernando Po. And the whole Fernando Po, you call it fiasco because they want people to go to Fernando Po, but instead work at Firestone. And so that's
right, because if they're looking for all these workers, which it never, of course, got 2 million workers, they didn't even get, 500,000 workers, but they needed all these people, these human beings. They were angry. Why are they working on the road project? Because that's the same period of time that the highway was being built to Ganta from Monrovia. Why are they, working on the road project? You have too many workers. The chiefs should be giving you a fraction of these workers, and we can use the rest of Firestone. Oh, they're sending people to Fernando Po. It becomes this huge scandal. Okay, well, we're going to embarrass them into stopping from exporting labor, even if it's voluntary or if it's forced. It's not really the issue. The issue was they wanted them to be forced to work at Firestone. And Beale implicated both the Liberian government and the United States government in this Firestone forced labor situation. The Liberian government.
And to understand how comfortable Firestone felt with President King, you had
and Jabari, that's what I was coming to. What does this Firestone have to do with President King?
The Firestone was so comfortable that they were, in some that I've read, publicly boasting how they're going to put these hundreds of thousands of Liberians to work for less than 24 cents, like no money. They were publicly boasting, bragging that they could do this. No shame, no sense of any wrongdoing. The level of comfort that Firestone had is what made them feel comfortable to do what they did. They felt comfortable.
Actually, let me correct something. This was on one of the slides that I removed for sake of time. It says, Professor Beale said, first, that Mr. Firestone carries out his announced plan of developing 1 million acres of rubber land in Liberia and of forcibly employing 3 million men.
Not 2.
It is inevitable that, despite his good intentions, compulsory labor and native demoralization will result. I mean, what's going on?
Wait, is it me or you?
Dennis?
Yeah,
We
I
hear you.
think you froze a little bit.
Yeah. That's their homeboy. Professor John, that's their homeboy. That's Firestone. King was Firestone's homeboy. That's who he was.
What do you mean?
I mean, the next slide speaks for itself. The
Okay.
next slide will speak for itself.
Call, it looks like
Am I-
someone trying to call you. Yeah, that's right.
If you look at the next slide, it speaks for itself. You have Harvey Firestone Jr. and President King. That's their homeboy. They feel comfortable. Then he covers for them. Well, oh, the following. Sorry, the following after. Yeah, right here. Homeboy defending them. Then he says no coercion of Firestone concession CBD King cables to State Department. We know good and well that's not true. But again, they feel comfortable with him. He gave up the land that was supposed to be given to Garvey to Firestone. Now they're making money.
But you should understand the economics of it too, right? Liberia was owing that story, right?
Mm-hmm.
How does that factor in, and how is it?
Understand. King was comfortable with Firestone, comfortable taking the loan, but the Liberian legislature was not. The Liberian legislature was very opposed. The Liberian legislature was very opposed to what King was doing. The Firestone agreement, the loans, the Liberian legislature was very opposed to it. It
Yeah,
was King that was comfortable taking or consider taking a loan and with having Firestone. They homeboy. That's they boy. That's what I'm gonna say. That's they homeboy. The
yeah,
Liberian legislature wasn't comfortable with him. Wasn't comfortable with Firestone running around. They weren't comfortable trying to take a loan. They wanted to be independent.
right. Thank you,
So I
Carl.
don't know.
You
I
were
don't know
saying
when I cut
something
out.
before.
Did you get what I read from Beale's statement?
No, no, you froze, so you can continue from there.
It's the imperialist. Let me go back and read it really quick. So Beale says, he said first that if Firestone carries out his announced plan of developing 1 million acres of rubber land in Liberia and of forcibly employing 3 million men. I said two. I misquoted. I'm reading it now. It said 3 million men. It is inevitable that despite his good intentions, compulsory labor and native demoralization will result. So these are some of his accusations against Firestone. Um, the Liberian government, the way that the laws are set up is that the legislature has to approve these agreements, that the president did not have the autonomy to do any of these things on his own. And if you remember from previous episodes, we talked about how President Hoover was really annoyed with the Liberian legislature. So was the British government. And President Hoover Herbert Hoover eventually says, you know what, we'll just install a dictator that doesn't have to answer to any legislature in that country because the legislature was independent minded at the time. So he gets really, really irritated. He gets really, really irritated with Liberia, and he's like, we'll just install a dictator. Because every time they tried to do something, the Liberian legislature would push back. In this particular case, King is doing things outside of what the government structure, outside of the constitutional function of the government. conventional history will have you believe that he resigned during his impeachment process because of Firestone. I'm sorry, because of Fernando Po. I believe his problems were mostly because of Firestone. His problems with the Liberian legislature. Probably a combination of both. But the part that's often omitted is that the legislature was not happy with the conditions at Firestone. Their constituents were complaining. Some of the legislatures came from that area in Gibi and Marshall territory, Gibi territory, really. And they were not happy with this at all.
So Carl, let's talk about the loan a little bit that brought in Firestone, and what was King's role, or did he try to bypass the legislature to do that?
Yes. So that was some of the problem as well. And one of the things that was reported in Buell's report is that the loan was a predatory loan.
And who's that?
And that it was meant to indebt Liberia, as many of the loans that they had proposed previously had, in such a way that they would be beholden to Firestone. And essentially to destroy Liberia's economy.
And what was the alternative? Just don't take it?
Renegotiate.
There were a lot of loans that were denied in the past, exactly. So we have Barclay that said, no, we're not taking the loan. Because it was bad terms, because Howard was was basically the equivalent of the Minister of Finance, and he advised Barclay, no, this is not a good thing. We can't take this loan. It will subjugate us. It will, we'll be upside down. It's predatory. They didn't take the loan. The British got angry with Barclay, got angry with Howard. They said all kinds of slanderous things about Howard, how he was corrupt. And remember, we had a whole episode where we said if Howard was corrupt, he would have taken the loan. How you say somebody corrupt for refusing to take a loan? If he was so corrupt and was playing in money, why wouldn't he have taken the loan and played in the money? So they like to slander the character of people who stand up for their country. And it's not only Liberia, that happens all over Africa. Those are the ones who get assassinated. Either character assassination or actual physical assassination. And the people that are praised are the ones who do what they want them to do. Even if they're corrupt.
Coach King, that's what she's addressing, right? What was the alternative to the loan, or the loan to the Britain? That's exactly what she's addressing.
In the past, just the recent past, when he was in government, when he wasn't president, but he was in government, he was part of a government that denied a similar loan from the British. There had been all these economic embargoes against Liberia. Liberians have been suffering because of these economic embargoes. Economic sabotage used as a way to pressure Liberia into subduing itself. And repeatedly, people said, okay, I would rather starve than give up our economic sovereignty. So Liberia was really facing hardships, not because of mismanagement, but because of Liberia's refusal to become an economic annexed colony, basically. And King didn't want the hardship anymore. So it's not that he was irrational. It's not that he was necessarily wrong. It's just that in his mind, his understanding of the world, it is easier for us, even though it won't be easier for everyone, it will be easier for us. If we cooperate with these people, we'll get to live well. I mean, hell, the rest of Africa is colonized. We can't fight these people. Everybody can't be free, but we can. If we cooperate, we'll be free. We're not going to be the ones working on the plantation. I'll be damned if they crush us economically and possibly militarily if I refuse to cooperate. But if I allow those Garveyites to come here, they could just come and just wage a violent war and just wipe us out. This was his thinking. It's stupid for us to fight these people. We don't have the power. We've been fighting these people since 1847. And as a result, we cannot thrive. But he forgets that his father was able to amass wealth and give him a good life without surrendering. He wanted to take a different road from all his predecessors because he didn't want to suffer and he didn't want to be killed.
So you see,
and we in the UNI episode we talked about dosing all these people dying at the same time under strange circumstances. UNI goes, he takes FER Johnson, sends him to Fernando Poe as an ambassador. For what? He just scattered all his leaders. He marginalizes the people who brought him up. And he aligns himself with the same people that Liberia has been fighting, or that have been fighting Liberia, I should say, since its independence. Because he believes that if he doesn't do that, they will just destroy the country violently. He's looking at Haiti and how Haiti's going through the same economic sabotage and oppression. He doesn't want that legacy of an economic embargo to continue. He wants prosperity, if not for everyone, at least for himself and his immediate circle. And in his mind, this is a better alternative than certain death, is what he was thinking. And I know he was thinking this because he wrote these things down. People at this point have seen a lot. World War I just finished. They know the war, the physical capabilities of the European allied powers. They could have crushed Liberia in the blink of an eye. So Charles D.B. King's position was rational. It was rational. I believe personally that he was wrong, but I understand what he was thinking and how he came to the decisions that he came to. And I understand a little bit about why he thought the way he did, why he wasn't willing to die like his predecessors were.
Thank you. So now in the picture here, we see him with Harvey Firestone. Very comfortable.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah.
That
I mean, and the thing I love about this picture, this is what I love about the pictures. I lay your coverage, right? So you've got Charles, this is in the executive mansion in Liberia. Harvey Firestone comes into the executive mansion. C.D.B. King, to me, better dressed than Harvey Firestone. Two men of privilege. He sees himself no different from Harvey Firestone. He doesn't see Harvey Firestone as being a boss. He sees himself as being of the same class. And in many ways, the type of privilege that he had, in contrast to the masses of people in both Sierra Leone and Liberia, where he had gone to school and lived, was probably exceeded the contrast of Harvey Firestone's upbringing, even though Harvey came from a very wealthy family. When this guy went to school in Sierra Leone, he would have had lived extreme privilege when he was a child, thanks to his father's ingenuity. Mm-hmm. So he felt comfortable with Harvey Firestone and considered him to be his friend. And Charles is known, President King is known for introducing, through Firestone in this whole situation, the first automobiles to Liberia. He also brought the first telegrams to Liberia. The transatlantic cable from Germany to West Africa was brought ashore in Liberia's tenure. The first telegraph sent from West Africa was sent from Liberia during his tenure. So there's a lot of innovation and development. What he wanted, he achieved, which was to bring wealth and comforts that were not known to Liberia or even most of West Africa before. I mean, Liberia had that transatlantic cable from Germany, landed in Liberia, and then crossed over to the United States during Charles D.B. King's presidency. This was huge at that period in time, to be able to instantly send a message across the ocean to the United States from Liberia. That happened during his tenure. Before, you would have to get on a ship with a message and travel before it arrived. Now you could send instant telegram. And he did it constantly. All of his telegraphs are documented. So the innovation and the cooperation with the European powers did bring in a lot of development. I mean, this is a period where you have the first concrete roads being built. So in the 1920s, 1924, 1923, 1924, by 1926, when the Harvard expedition team comes, there's cars rolling all over the place in their videos and the photos that they take. So President King was the first president to own a car, the first Liberian to own a car, to own an automobile. The others rode in carts with oxen, or they walked on their 2 feet. And contrary to what people believe, they were never carried in hammocks. That was a missionary thing. They walked. When President Coleman went to Boperu, he marched to Boperu. There's accounts of him removing his boots across the creek.
Yeah.
So
And you
this
said
is
no president was carrying hammer.
This is huge. Huh?
You said no president was carrying hammer.
No president was carried in a hammock until this point. The only reason people say that is because there's a picture of President Tubman being at the port of not the port, at the beach at Buchanan. There was no port there. His security were carrying him from the boat to the beach. And they said, oh, he was being carried in hammock, and everyone is dressed exactly the same. They're all his security people, but that's a different story. But no, presidents were not carried in hammock. There's no evidence of that happening before this time. Even President King, there's no evidence of it. The evidence of hammocks being used was always the pictorial and written traditions have always been Europeans, missionaries, Americans, and missionaries.
I mean,
They introduced that.
Oral history in my home that President Barclay was carrying hammer in my part of the world, but that's another story.
Did Arthur Barclay go there?
That's what I said.
Or yeah. Arthur Barclay went to where? That's interesting. I'd like to see that. I mean, you said oral history, but there would be written records that he went there too.
Yeah. Well, I've not read it. I've heard from oral history.
Yeah, I've heard a lot of things from oral history too. So the military was built up during this period tremendously. The United States government pumped a lot of money into building up the Liberian frontier forces. And the reason the United States built up the frontier forces was because they needed that frontier force. So African militaries are not structured to protect African people anywhere in Africa. All the militaries that were created on the African continent, modern militaries, I'm not talking about like the Abyssinia or / Ethiopia, where they had a military to protect them against invasion, or the Empire of Morocco. I'm speaking in general. The modern militaries that were created most of them were created for the purpose of subjugating Africans in the interest of European economic advancement and their colonial powers. So when they start building up the frontier forces, now during this era, you're starting to see these people being trained to carry out the orders of the American economic interest, which is Firestone. So the military is being pumped up by the US government, and they are being instructed to forcibly take people to work in Firestone. And so one of the things I was reading was that they were given boots. But because most of the indigenous people that were in the military did not grow up wearing shoes, they grew up on their bare feet. The boots used to hurt their feet. So they will remove their boots and they will march and do everything the way that they're comfortable. Because if you don't wear shoes when you're born, your feet develop more naturally and you become more comfortable without shoes. Putting in shoes will then restrict your feet and cause all kinds of problems, especially if you walk for great distances.
Mm.
So this slide, I'll let you guys take over. Um, Basically, this is a excerpt from a publication called The Negro Worker from November 1st, 1930.
Where Terror Reigns by J. Comfeder. During recent months, the capitalist press in England and America has been carrying on a campaign of slander against Liberia. The purpose of this campaign is to justify the policy of annexation of this country, which has been openly advocated even in the British Parliament. In order to further prepare the way for taking over Liberia and placing it under a mandate of one of the imperialist powers, Great Britain or America, the League of Nations has set up a commission to put through this dirty deal. Venezuela is one of the countries represented on the commission to pass judgment on Liberia, and because of this, we are publishing the following account of the terror in the South American hellhole so that the workers, peasants, and all anti-imperialist fighters of Liberia will recognize the character of their known foreign slave masters, who are equally as notorious as the black capitalist oppressors in Liberia and the white imperialists, exploiters in other parts of Africa. The writer of this article was himself imprisoned for 3 months in La Rotunda dungeon in Venezuela. Ed. The Negro Worker, November 1, 1930.
What are your thoughts?
What he's saying is very, it's very similar and it was actually a mindset that a lot of black workers and black people who were communists were speaking about. If Liberia is taken by uh, white imperialists, it's going to often come to form through black capitalists. And, these black capitalists are just as dangerous as these white capitalists.
Well, I
Hmm.
mean, this is a very communist publication, The Negro Worker. This is black communism at its height. And these black communists are also anti-Marcus Garvey. They consider Garvey and his movement to be a black capitalist movement. So there's a lot of confusion in ideology here. But one of the things that is consistent between the black communists and the black Pan-Africanists, which later on ideologically kind of have a convergence during the 1950s, but at this point in history, they were separate in separate ideologies. Whereas the black workers were aligned with poor workers from all backgrounds all over the world. They didn't have the same uh, sense of alliance with wealthy, privileged African people. And this is the first time that they are identifying Liberian elites is during the Charles D.B. King era. This was not done before then by African people anywhere. It wasn't until the King era that they start to refer to President King and therefore the ruling class of Liberia as black capitalists. And they start to make the distinction between the masses of Liberians and the leadership, because this is where it is distinctly and overtly expressed. Even though you had President Howard and President Barkley, they were never described in this manner in Black publications. They were always seen both by the Pan-Africanists and the communists as being the underclass fighting for the rights of African people. It is at this point there's a divergence from that, and now the leadership is being seen as part of the problem because they have now aligned themselves in the minds of even George Padmore. They have now aligned themselves with imperialists through this proposition of Firestone, because nothing is more enraging to a Black communist than African people aligning themselves with venture capitalists and what they consider to be tools of economic exploitation in these major companies and corporations.
And black and a lot of communists at the time saw that as the same thing, or were noticing that similar. One was they said that we warned the Liberian people that the capture of Liberia by these white millionaires will be the opening wedge for the effort to conquer Africa and to subject the whole African people into a tyrannical rule such as what we now see in Haiti. And what is a way that they can capture the Liberian state? Through these black capitalists like the Kings, who are now aligned with them, their interests, and their objectives.
Thank you. Our time is fast spent, but we want to give some time for calls. And so, as we go through the last two slides, if you want to join the conversation, please call 605-313-6004. The code is 791-403 pound. And we are discussing presidents of Liberia. Today, we are discussing the 17th president, President Charles D.B. King. And Charlie King time, that's what people say in Liberia. What does that mean? And why we continue to state that? Keep following.
So we pretty much talked about this already. Herbert Hoover had some, after King's presidency, when Edwin Barkley, the nephew of President Arthur Barkley, so now we have again another president who is not a descendant of African Americans. And Edwin Barkley's parents were born in Barbados. He was born in Liberia. And so Edwin Barkley, when he took over after King, Herbert Hoover, everyone was outraged and angry because Edwin started to reverse some of the findings of the League of Nations. So Hoover suspended, again, instated the embargo. They say he suspended relations, but it was really, he reinstated the economic embargo. And an economic embargo is a complete cutoff of Liberia from any reasonable trade. So it'd be like nobody is shipping anything to the Freeport. Nobody's going to buy anything from you. Nobody's going to sell anything to you at a reasonable rate. So he's going to starve the country. This was Herbert Hoover's way of forcing Liberia into becoming an economic annexed satellite of the United States. So he suspends relations to press Monrovia into compliance with a trusteeship. They wanted to put a trustee over the country to make decisions and not have the legislature rebuking and voting out policies that they thought were bad for Liberian people. Okay, you want to do that? We won't trade with you. You won't get any food. You won't get any support from us. You're going to go back to those old days when we used to starve you. You want to go through that again? Edwin said, yes, we're willing to starve. And so in 1930, the committee's report was published. And although, it couldn't substantiate charges of slavery and forced labor, it implicated government officials, including both King and his second vice president, Allen Yancey. James II Wesley was his first vice president. Allen Yancey replaced him. And basically, they accused him of profiting from forced labor because Yancey was basically, before he even became vice president, was using the frontier forces to grab people and force them or coerce them into going to Fernando Po. The House of Representatives then started the impeachment proceedings against King, mainly for the Firestone Agreement. And then King, instead of being impeached, he resigned. and was succeeded by Edmund Barclay, who fought, to the very end to, uh, sad and tragic, you know, um, against the grain to try to retain Liberian sovereignty. The good news is he did. He succeeded in, working with the legislature to protect Liberia against this imposed trusteeship. President Charles D.B. King uh, died in the year 1961 on, I think it was on September, I can't remember. Sorry, I'm like getting tired. He died in September 1961. And actually September 4th, it says so right here. He died on September 4th, 1961. And this is an article that was published by the Associated Press. It was published in the New York Times on the day of his death. He had been ambassador to the United States. He was very respected when he was U.S. ambassador. Probably one of the most successful ambassadors in Liberia, in the history of Liberia, to ever serve. He was a former president, of course, so he understood foreign policy well. And while he was at the U.S. Embassy, he was very much respected by the Americans. And you have to remember, at the time that he served, the civil rights movement was still going on. African Americans that had been in the United States for many generations, some as much as 16 generations, did not have basic human rights in the country of their birth, in the country of the birth of their ancestors, really. They didn't have much human rights. There was still segregation. There was, even in the northern states that claimed that they didn't have Jim Crow, African Americans could not enter most hotels, could not enter most restaurants. Even performers, famous performers, had to enter the concert halls through the back doors and leave through the back doors. At this time, this man was serving as ambassador with dignity, poise and grace, and self-respect. There's a lot to be said. We always talk about Liberia in isolation of the rest of the world, and we have to also understand what the world was like at that time in history, and to look like us in a time when the entire world looked at us with great contempt and hatred. And for men to be able to hold their heads up and find solutions for their conditions in their own ways is important to recognize and respect. Like I said, though I do not agree with the decisions that President King made, I do know that he made those decisions because at the time, considering the tremendous odds he stood against, it seemed to him to be the most reasonable and rational option under the circumstances.
And how did he justify, or how did he write down that this is why I'm doing this?
Say that again?
If I say, you say you think this was, did King himself write this down as to his motivation why he was making these decisions?
He didn't have to
are you inferring?
explicitly write it down, but through his speeches, through the quotes from newspaper articles of the time period, through his speeches, it is a reasonable inference that he felt that he was doing the right thing.
Right, because
at no time did he articulate that I'm doing this to be wicked.
yeah, I mean,
it was always, it was always expressing his beliefs,
right,
understanding that Liberia didn't really have a military. The military was really, an American imposition. And understanding that the great power of the West, and also himself being a person of privilege, all those things combined, I believe, shaped his decision.
Thank you. Let me bring in two callers here already waiting in the queue. Our first caller here is Charles King. This is no coincidence.
Hello.
Hello, King.
Yes, how are you?
Very well, thank you.
Hello, Coach King.
And Jabari, thank you all very much for the objectivity. This is what is important. And I want to, and to you, Dennis, the last time I didn't mention Dennis, so he got upset with me. So, and you too, Dennis, thank you very much. What I want to say briefly is that I like when the discussion stems on, for example, the loan, the Firestone, and the loan to Britain. I always like to ask and like people to know what were the alternatives that existed at the time, not now when we say, oh, he could get it from the World Bank and this and that. What existed at that time and period in history? And Carl, you bring this out a lot to show the background. Someone says, King was an evil man. Well, anyone can say something, but give me substantive information that would say King had to do or could not have done it. I mean, we know that Du Bois was sent by the American government to Liberia with a warning to administration that if they allow what's his name,
Garvey,
Marcus Garvey in, America will pull out support for Liberia. No more. Okay, so now what was King to do? Or anyone? It could have been Brown. It could have been Doe. It could have been anyone in that position at that time. What was the alternative? This is what Liberians, the average Liberians, don't want to find out. They just accept, oh, Garvey, and they think Du Bois and Garvey. But those are two revolutionaries also. They had their minds of their own. Strong Pan-Africanism in their blood. But they are also constrained. Now, Carl, I am not a historian. I don't claim to be. And I just like to investigate and bring out information for people such as you and others who are more qualified than I am. But as an investigator, I don't make decisions. I investigate and let those involved put it together. So, Carl, I want you to speak on, for the rest of the listeners, what alternatives did the administration have to either deny Firestone, and what about the loan of Britain? And what about Hitler? What about all these other circumstances that causes a person to take an action? So he's not evil, but what did he have? What could he have done? Now, as long as, again, I will soon end, those should understand that you cannot use today's concepts and information for a century back then. You have to see what was the consciousness of the world at that time, the economic situation, political situation, and world issues at that time. That is what I want you to talk about. I'm not qualified for that. And I'm looking to you all for explanation.
Thank you, Coach.
Please, thank you.
And Coach King, if you don't mind, can you state your relationship with President King? Are you great-grand or grand?
My grandfather.
Oh, your grandfather.
Used to talk to us. He used to talk to me, and he used to tell me what was happening. He used his driver. When he used to go up to Firestone, his driver, Charlie, and I would be in the car, and Charlie would look at some of the government people who were quote-unquote, and I want to mention indigenous, and say, Ebu, look at that man over there, Chief so-and-so. He was one of those complaining against King, and now he's running to Firestone to sell his rubber. You see? You complain about the same man, and then you turn around and use the services that he brought in. Now, I'm not seeing it right or wrong, because, Carl, you brought in the historical thing.
Right.
And I just want to mention also, one more thing, in Minnesota, when they were granted, the Americans granted, I think the Liberians some ability to go forward with their citizenship. Right. One of the representatives from Minnesota, and I'm not saying it right or wrong, but he said one of the reasons why we should support the Liberians is because during the time of Firestone was in Liberia during the rubber issue. But I'm just saying they cited that as one of the reasons. Right or wrong, that's not for me to say. I'm not a politician or
Thank you. So at that time, there were people who were actually against the Firestone deal, just like the driver said.
Yeah.
Okay.
But they were using the Firestone deal to go get their money on the rubber farm.
Thank you. I mean, what was the alternative?
Okay, Please call.
Thank you. Thank you. Let me bring in. We got three more callers here. I want to
Let me
get
let
them
me
in
address
quickly.
Coach King. Okay, however you want to do it.
Yeah. Okay. Go ahead. Address that, and then we
Yeah, I
can.
think it's good to just address one before I forget.
Yeah.
So, Coach King, thanks for that insight. There was, if you compare his presidency to that of Arthur Barkley and the choices that they made, Arthur Barkley took the alternative choice. There was an alternative. The alternative is we're going to just starve. We will not negotiate as we say today, as the Americans say today. We're not going to negotiate with economic terrorists, and we're not going to take a loan to our detriment. So President Howard, when he wasn't president, when he was a secretary of finance or minister of finance, what it would be called minister of finance now, under Arthur Barkley, they made a decision in collusion with the legislature to, okay, I'm being coerced to sign this, but you guys are going to shoot it down. And they did not take a predatory loan. Howard then negotiated for a loan on better terms. And that loan was concluded and paid off during the first year. The final payment was made during the first year of King's presidency. So President King was part of the Howard administration. He was part of the Barkley administration. He knew that this loan was bad for Liberia. President King was aware that this plantation was going to destroy Liberia's ability to feed itself. Before Firestone, Liberia was able to feed itself its basic starch staple, which was rice. Firestone destroyed that. So even the comment, sir, that the driver made about the guy running to go sell his rubber to Firestone, it is possible that that guy in the past had been selling his coffee or his rice or something else. It turned the economy into a cash crop economy, which is not in the best interest of any country to be a cash crop plantation. That does not create enough wealth or jobs for a country to sustain itself. It destroys countries' abilities to feed itself. And yes, he was coerced into doing it. There was a lot of pressure from very powerful nations. And as I said, I don't agree with the decision, but I do understand the rationale. It is, people get tired of being put under an economic embargo. People get tired of the pressure that comes from these powerful countries. But there was absolutely an alternative. And that alternative was taken generation after generation in Liberian history. And that alternative thrust Liberia into poverty, because it was either poverty or subjugation. You be free or poor, or if you be rich and the rest be subjugated. Those were the two options: free and poor, or subjugation.
Thank you. And talking about Firestone and Pusawa, we we also learned that on April 5th, Saudi Arabia donated over 29,000 bags of rice to Liberia
That's tragic.
because our land is gone. Firestone again. All right, that's
That's tragic.
Evans Morris. You were
I,
waiting. Evans, you alive? Go ahead.
Yeah, President, what you calling my name? Are you checking if I'm in the class? I'm present. So thank you for the show. And
We are
I didn't have
surprised that
much
you
to
are
say. I
not the
wanted to.
first. That's why.
No. I was actually gonna, ask you to bring in, Coach King first before I came in. I just hope we will be as sympathetic as we are to, former President King. To our current president now when he leaves, was he reasoning some of his decisions, and be kind on him when he leaves. But let me just say, I want to agree with something that Mrs. Famila said earlier on. Is we all kind of understand for those who are Garveyites, they look at King as one of their mortal enemies because he didn't, he kind of thwarted the promised land that was supposed to be given to Garvey to build for the UNIA. So a lot of people kind of don't like him because of that reason. But I want to kind of uh, agree with what Mrs. Famila said. Trying to look at some of the reasons why he
he made decisions that he made. And it's important when you look at how people are, brought up. Your upbringing plays a key role in your worldview. And I think his upbringing, like she said, he was, like an elite of the elite in Liberia. He felt he was a capitalist. He wasn't a communist. So, those ideologies probably play a part in his decision making to a certain extent. So when we're looking at him from that perspective, we can't look at him as a quote unquote Pan-Africanist because he was far from that. So all of his decisions was, perhaps maybe at best nationalistic, if we want to look at it in that view, thinking only about Liberia rather than the black race, as a whole. So we can give him some leeway, but obviously we have a lot of criticism for him. But I want to take a different perspective on this today. Try to find the silver lining, perhaps.
Is it because you want the same to be done to President Weah? You don't have to answer. Let me take the next caller.
Right, Mr. John.
Okay. Our next caller here is Oliver. Oliver, you live.
Hello. Yeah, thank you so much, Mr. John. My favorite colleague and gentlemen, thank you for being part of the show today. I hope you guys can hear me. Can you guys hear me?
Yeah, very clearly. Go ahead, Oliver.
All right, thank you so much. Okay, so thank you so much for having, I don't need to code was just like the wish we switch ahead when God was talking about giving leniency to President Weah for the situation of Mr. King's presidency. And I was like, if you about to go to Nigeria on this guy to say what you mean about all of that. But then the same thing that Mr. King talked about, I remember back in the day, I think it was 2011 again, court. The BWI was having an alumni in Baltimore, and I filmed it. I did a photo. And Mr. King was there. His great-granddaughter was there, was receiving an award. And he said the same thing about how we were elected to have Firestone being there because I had not been so. The whole country was going to crumble. But then I was trying to find a way to how to interview to see why he said that. But unfortunately, there was no way I was able to do that. And hearing his voice, I really appreciated on that. And the second thing was that was talked about was I remember once upon a time, which I can't really give you a detail of what I can give you right now because it was 3 years ago. I think the got a video where they said that the gentleman is talking about who was the Pan-Africanism gave money to set the doctor to go to Liberia and buy a property to relocate few Liberians and all that. Unfortunately, according to the story that I got, was President Douglas did not buy the property, but he rather got in contact with Firestone, told him that was a good opportunity of him investing in Africa. And because of that, when these guys went to see about the property, unfortunately, they were not paid for. So that was the reason why they were deported. I'm not too sure because it's been a long time. Okay. So, on the whole thing that, and I understand what I'm coming from and all of that, but I think that's what I was able to get used to the whole thing. But unfortunately, thank you, because this particular history channel is one of my biggest history channels. So I always, like to be part of good history when it comes to,
Thank you.
So thank you for having me. And you take the time.
Thank you, Oliver. Thank you so much. And Coach King, say good analysis, live it, excellent points. Also, I will Rukas, good point raised that the color race. I'm actually leaning to CDB King. The mistakes was actually made with other presidents who came later and had better position as it relates to human rights and better wages. They should have renegotiated the Firestone Agreement. So, Carl, you can go ahead. Carl, you can unmute yourself, please.
I was saying the Firestone Agreement was renegotiated to much better terms during the Tubman era. Made sure that people had
what? That was better?
Yes, because it was during the Tubman era that Firestone had schools, made sure that they had better housing for their workers, I mean, it's been progress, but the original conditions when they were clearing that rainforest in the 1920s, nobody was really being compensated. They were being fed. That was pretty much it. And they were not free to go. By the time Tubman comes in, they make sure that there's a free education for the children of the workers. There's a lot of things. They make sure that the hospitals are available and there's health care for the workers. It wasn't like that before. So of course that's an improvement. And again, nobody was forced to work at Firestone. Nobody was indentured to Firestone. So there were a lot of things that, though Tubman was a dictator, but he made sure that Firestone improved conditions on that plantation. So by the 1950s, things were much better. Than Firestone becomes a place that people want to work. And Liberians start celebrating Firestone because now you can get educated, there's benefits. It wasn't like that before.
Thank you.
And I didn't hear anything the last caller said.
Same.
It was about the same Firestone that he heard Coach King say something that, and he's glad that he's saying it now. Watch us tomorrow at 1 p.m. the new day with Priscilla Inato. We're going to be talking about the 6 genders revealed in Jewish Tamil and biology. Keith Jobs will be here as the guest. Then at 6, I'm going to be hosting Pastor Dr. Chandler Freeman on our show, Hello Pastor. You don't want to miss it. We have 2 minutes to close. Let me get your closing, Jabari and Carl.
Charles D.B. King's presidency is a major turning point. It is one of the major deciding factors in the course of Liberian history that relates to this day. Not understanding his psychology, not understanding the things that he did during his administration is doing a disservice to Liberian history. You have to know Charles D.B. King. Charles D.B. King should be taught in every school in depth because he is that major turning point. He doesn't follow through his predecessors, and because he doesn't follow through with his predecessors' mentality, he ends up leading the country down a way that still haunts us to this day. And I will always consider that, an unfortunate reality. His presidency, I don't see him as a bad person outside of politics, but within politics, what he did was horrible, and it needs to be understood in that manner.
Thank you, Jabari. Carl.
Charles D.B. King he had a lot of firsts. He was the first to celebrate the 100th anniversary of the landing of the Elizabeth at Sherbro Island in what is now Sierra Leone. He had that 100th anniversary of Pioneers Day. In fact, the first mention of the word pioneers in reference to the repatriated African Americans and recaptured Africans on the Elizabeth and the was during Charles D.B. King's era. So that term pioneer then becomes entrenched in the Liberian culture. It was also during the Charles D.B. King era that this sense of class is really solidified in Liberia, the sense of classism. Because it is during his era that he introduces, kind of uplifts the lifestyle and the expectations of people who had money and wealth in Liberia. There starts to be a greater distinction between the haves and the have-nots during his era. Again, because of the kind of privilege he was raised with. Overall, Jabari is correct that this did mark a turning point. There's always an alternative. Even, if the alternative is death, there's always an alternative. Is it a rational and reasonable alternative? I'm going to say yes, because this was an alternative choice that was made again and again. And Liberia's sovereignty was never on the line. Was always on the line, but was never yielded, though we lost territory. Next, 2 weeks from today, we're going to talk about Edwin Barclay. And we're going to talk about Edwin, and we're going to talk about his having to correct some of the mistakes of President King. We're going to talk about that in depth, and we're going to talk about his um, disappointment in trying to carry the torch of his uncle Arthur that was passed to Howard, and in his mind dropped by King. He had to pick that torch up again and try to carry it forward. So that's going to be our discussion next time. And thank you so much for your calls and your comments and your donations and everything else. One last announcement, which is that Jabari's organization, BAIO, along with Save the State, are going to be starting a Saturday school, a mentorship school for young people in Liberia. And when I say young people, I mean actual children between the ages of 12 and 14, so kind of that middle school age. And it's going to be great. Please look forward to ways that you all can contribute to that, whether you're in Liberia or in the United States. We are going to need to get chairs and audio video equipment. We're going to try to keep it as simple as possible. We don't want to focus more on content. They're going to be the classes are going to be live streamed with members of the organizations, professionals discussing with the children about what they do, their career paths. They're going to be discussing with the children about Liberian history, ways to uplift their self-esteem, and ways to develop their critical mind and be able to think for themselves. So we do look forward to those of you that support the Liberian History Channel also supporting a very important project to help supplement the education that these young people are getting with, some real civic education and real, So we will probably start a GoFundMe just to structure it.
Right.
But we do appreciate you and thank you in advance because we're depending on you all to support that project.
Please. I mean, these are the good things that are coming up. Most of the time, people watch the Liberia History Channel and say, "Oh, why don't you write a book? Or why don't you do this?" These are all good ideas. But one of the things coming out of this effort is to have what Carl just spoke about. So if you want to learn more, please give or call Jabari or the History Channel a call or someone from Save the State so that you can learn more and be a part. It is very important. I mean, this is so good, and I'm so happy that BIO and Save the State combined effort to do that. Thank you so much, Jabari. Thank you, Cole. I want to thank all of you for tonight. I want to thank our viewers, those who commented, those who called in, and even those who will watch later. Always focus on Liberia, man. I mean, even if I can go back to our ancestors, I'm going to die a happy man because of what we're doing here at Focus on Liberia. Never before in the history of our country had Liberian history being presented to people in such a clear and a very distinct manner. And we're doing that. So I am so happy and thank you all for your support. At this time, we're going to close with our song that says, "We are all Liberians." Whatever you believe about President King, whether he was a horrible president or the best or average, whatever, we are all Liberians. And we should do whatever it takes to make our country the glorious land of liberty. Have a good night and God bless you. We are all Liberians, man. And I love this country.
We are Liberians.